When you talk about a mystery that hits close to home, something that crawls under your skin because it has paperwork attached to it, you usually have to look pretty far back. But this one is different, because it didn't happen in some crumbling castle on a lonely hill. It happened in an apartment block full of people in a neighborhood called Vallecas in Madrid, Spain, right in the early 90s. Which isn't really that long ago. I mean, the family, the Gutierrez Lazaros, they weren't trying to sell a book or get famous. They were just trying to live their lives in a modest 5-story block of flats. And I think that's why this story particularly always sticks with me. Because it's the sheer ordinaries of the location, the way it just crept into this completely normal place and became something nobody could quite explain. Not even the people who are paid to explain things. So we are going to lean into the facts, the actual documents, and the things that were seen that night. Let's talk about it. If you are into aliens, true crime, unsolved mysteries, and the paranormal, then you are in the right place. Don't forget to hit that like, the hype button, and also to subscribe so you can join the community and spread the love. The officers arrived just before midnight, around 11:30 p.m. on November 27, 1992. And they weren't expecting anything more than a noisy neighbor complaint or maybe a small domestic issue, which is what the initial call probably sounded like on the radio. They pulled up to the housing block on Calle Louis Marin, and the first thing you notice, I think, is just how quiet it was outside, especially for that time of night in a densely populated area of Madrid, giving the whole street a kind of heavy, expectant atmosphere. The two officers went up. One was Inspector Jose Pedro Negri and the other was his partner, but it was Negri who would ultimately write the report that stamped this whole thing into the record books later on. When they knocked, it was the mother, Concepcion, who opened the door. And the first thing Negri saw was that she wasn't hysterical or shouting. She was just completely and totally drained of emotion, standing there with this weary, terrified resignation that you only see in people who have been pushed well past their breaking point. He said they stepped inside and immediately felt a kind of unusual tension in the air. A different kind of silence than the one outside. One that was thick and heavy, like the atmosphere before a serious thunderstorm where you could almost taste the humidity. The apartment itself was small and clearly lived in, but it had this kind of unsettling, almost frozen quality to it, like everyone inside was holding their breath and had been for a long time. And you could see that the other children in the family, the two younger sisters and the brother, were huddled together watching the police with these huge, wide, frightened eyes. Concepcion started to explain to the officers what had been happening, but her voice was low and shaky, and she kept looking over her shoulder toward the corridor as if whatever she was talking about was just waiting out of sight. They hadn't even finished the initial conversation when the officers heard the first sound that gave them pause. A noise coming from the unoccupied dining room, described in the report as a strong, dry knocking sound that seemed to originate from nowhere in particular. Negri and his partner exchanged a look, because that kind of sound is exactly the sort of thing people complain about. But the way it resonated in the still apartment felt unnaturally sharp and directed. As they walked toward the source of the noise, they had to step over the children who were now clinging to their mother and trying to disappear behind her, clearly used to the sound but terrified of its implication. They reached the dining room, a small space with simple furniture, and that's where the atmosphere shifted completely. Because as they were looking around, trying to figure out if it was the pipes or the building settling, a cupboard door, a door to a cabinet or a wardrobe, suddenly slid open. Not just a little, but fully and rapidly. The officers were just standing there, and they confirmed later on that no one was near it. And that's when things really started to take a turn, forcing Negri to move beyond the initial assumption of a hoax or a simple misunderstanding and acknowledge that there was something more profoundly strange happening in that small apartment. To really understand why the arrival of two police officers was such a necessary final point of desperation for this family, we have to go back to the summer of the previous year, 1991, to the life of the oldest daughter, Estefania Gutierrez Lazaro. A bright, normal kid who was 17 years old at the time and, by all accounts, just navigating that complicated line between childhood and young adulthood. Now, sources differ on the exact month, but it was around August of 1991 when Estefania started getting involved in things that were definitely outside the norm for her, specifically dabbling in the occult with a few friends, which in this case meant they were trying to conduct a seance at their school. It wasn't some elaborate dark ritual, it was a common enough thing for teenagers, a Ouija board and a handful of curiosity. But it's the next part that nobody can really agree on, which is what actually happened during that session. But the report suggests that the teacher walked in and broke up the gathering, smashing the board as he did it. The family maintains that it was shortly after this incident that Estefania began to suffer from a series of very serious and unnerving physical episodes, including what they described as convulsions, seeing shadowy figures, and hearing voices whispering her name when no one was around. Symptoms that seemed to escalate rapidly and defied any simple medical explanation. Concepcion took her daughter to doctor after doctor, specialist after specialist, and not a single one could diagnose the origin of the sudden and terrifying change in this previously healthy girl, with every test coming back negative and the doctors ultimately shrugging their shoulders and suggesting a psychiatric evaluation, which the mother resisted. The confusion and the fear in the home were intense, with the family constantly on edge, watching Estefania's condition worsen as these fits become more frequent, always accompanied by this deepening sense of dread that permeated the small apartment on Louis Marin. The situation came to a sudden and tragic end when Estefania suffered a final, severe episode and died abruptly in the hospital in August 1991. And though the official cause was documented as sudden death, the family was left not only with grief, but with a lingering, powerful question mark hanging over the circumstances of her passing, unable to reconcile the sudden, bizarre illness with the finality of her death. You have to remember the time and place. Vallecas was a working-class neighborhood, and there was a very strong, close-knit, and traditionally Catholic culture there, meaning the fear of the supernatural or the demonic was a very real thing, not just a concept in a horror movie. So when the unsettling activity began in the months after Estefania's funeral, it landed on an already primed emotional landscape. It wasn't a sudden explosion, it started subtly like a draft you couldn't trace, with objects around the house, particularly photos of Estefania, seeming to move or fall off shelves when no one was nearby. A kind of constant low-level harassment that was easy to initially dismiss as faulty wiring or the building settling. But the disturbances started to become bolder and more specific, like doors slamming on their own, loud, heavy thumps echoing throughout the apartment late at night when everyone was asleep, and the unsettling discovery of a large, heavy crucifix that was typically kept in a bedroom, completely unscrewed from the wall and inverted. One of the most terrifying details the family constantly cited was the heavy wooden wardrobe that began to mysteriously slide across the floor of the children's room. A piece of furniture so heavy it required two people to move. And this movement was observed multiple times. This wasn't just things going bump in the night. This was an escalation that went from easily dismissible to physically undeniable. And after over a year of living with it, the family had reached a point where they generally believed something non-human, something attached to Estefania's final months, had taken up permanent residence in their home. The family members, terrified and isolated, finally realized that they weren't dealing with a simple maintenance issue or stress reaction anymore. So they made the only call they felt they had left, reaching out for the most grounded, skeptical, and official authority they could think of: the National Police. The night the police were called wasn't marked by a single catastrophic event, but rather by the sheer accumulation of terror that had finally broken the family spirit. A relentless barrage of small, unbelievable occurrences that left them totally exhausted. You have to picture them there in the apartment, Conception and her husband completely unable to protect their remaining children from a threat they couldn't even see, and the children themselves too frightened to sleep alone, all of them huddled together in a state of permanent, jumpy anxiety. What finally pushed Conception to pick up the phone was perhaps one more instance of a repeated and terrifying event. The shattering of glass in the living room, specifically cabinet doors, that seemed to explode inward without any visible external force. And that sound was the final straw. They weren't calling the police because they thought the police could arrest the ghost. They were calling because they needed an external witness, someone official and skeptical whose very presence would either force the activity to stop or perhaps more desperately provide some kind of official record that would justify them fleeing their own home. What they feared was simple, They feared that whatever had tormented Estefania in her final months hadn't been satisfied, that it had instead attached itself to the home, and that it was now turning its attention to the younger children, making them feel like they were living inside a ticking clock that they couldn't stop. The emotional temperature in the home was that of a siege, a quiet, desperate battle fought not with fists or guns, but with silence and fear, where every sudden noise or flicker of light was a fresh assault on their already frayed nerves. When Inspector Negri and his partner entered that dining room after the cupboard's door slid open, they did what any good officer would do. They initiated a calm, systematic walkthrough of the apartment, methodically checking every room, every closet, and every window to find a logical human explanation for what they had just witnessed. They were looking for thin wires, compressed air tanks, hidden mechanisms, or an open window that could cause a draft. But the apartment was secure. Everything seemed to be in its place, except, of course, for the unsettling feeling that pervaded the air, which they couldn't exactly write down in the report. As they moved down the corridor, past the huddled family, Negri made his way to a small, dark bedroom, which the family had identified as one of the centers of the activity. And it was in this room that the activity truly ramped up in front of the two official witnesses. The police report documents that, as they stood inside the room, an object that was resting on a small shelf, sources say it was a photograph, was suddenly knocked off and hit the floor. And both officers confirmed that they did not see anyone touch it, nor was there any visible movement that could have accounted for the fall. It was an instant, a simple sharp event, but it carried a weight far heavier than the fallen object itself because it further validated the family's stories in the eyes of the official investigators. But then, as the officers were conferring with the parents about what they had just seen, a few feet away, a large framed crucifix that had been hanging securely on the wall suddenly broke free from its mooring and fell to the floor. And the police report specifically notes that the metal figure of Christ was partially broken off the cross, a detail that must have resonated deeply with the highly religious family. What followed next was a set of observations that were less about movement and more about atmosphere, details that defy simple explanation but were documented nonetheless. The officers noted that as they moved through certain areas of the apartment, they experienced abrupt and drastic temperature changes, moving from the normal warmth of the apartment into sudden pockets of intense cold, almost like walking past an open freezer door. This was accompanied by the sound of more unexplained noises, the strong, dry knocking sound that seemed to follow them from room to room, a constant low-level percussive sound that had no identifiable source. After about 30 minutes of this escalating unexplainable activity, Inspector Negri realized he couldn't dismiss this as an illusion or a prank. He was a law enforcement officer trained to see evidence and logic, and the evidence in front of him was simply the reality that heavy objects were moving without human intervention. The report was filed, documenting the movement of a cabinet door, the loud noises, the falling crucifix, the temperature anomalies, and the shattered glass. An official record signed and attested to by an inspector of the National Police. the only known police report in Spain that officially documents a claimed paranormal phenomena. The immediate aftermath was a brief moment of quiet relief for the family, knowing that their story was no longer just a private, terrifying madness, but an actual event that had been witnessed and recorded by authorities. But that relief was short-lived. Predictably, the police report became a kind of instant media sensation in Spain, especially in Madrid. Because it had that official seal of approval, it wasn't just hearsay, it was written down by a respected inspector, launching the case into the public consciousness as the most famous example of a documented poltergeist in Spanish history. Skeptics and journalists immediately descended, of course, offering every plausible counter-explanation imaginable, suggesting everything from infrasound, so it reaches a low-frequency vibration that can cause feelings of dread and move like objects, to simple repeated structural settling in the old building, all the way to outright fraud perpetrated by the frightening family itself. The family, for their part, eventually decided they could no longer live in a place that held such trauma and fear, and moved out of the apartment altogether, leaving the apartment on Calle Louis Marin and the unsettling history it held behind them. The disturbances they reported eventually ceased after they left the building. A detail that always complicated the matter for investigators, suggesting either that the phenomena was generally attached to the family itself or that the power of suggestion and stress had played a much larger role. To this day, the core facts remain. A young woman named Estefania Gutierrez Lazaro died in August 1991. And a little over a year later, Inspector Jose Pedro Negri and his partner filled a signed official report detailing unexplainable activity within the family's home, activity they had personally witnessed and could not logically account for. The debate in Spain over the truth of the Vallecas poltergeist has never really quieted down, with everyone from structural engineers to paranormal investigators offering theories that fit their own worldview. So what do you think? Truth? Fiction? You decide.